welcome everybody. Thanks a lot for coming. I've never done this before with Skype in the background, but I assume it's working and you can see and hear everything. We're really, really lucky to have with us Chacon and Helena Olea talking about the situation of immigrants' rights in the United States. Chacon is the co-founder and executive director of Alianza Americas, and Helena Olea is the human rights advisor for the Alianza Americas and also a professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. They're both based in Chicago, but Oscar is appearing from El Salvador right now. And rather than cutting into their time anymore, I will let them go ahead and tell us about the situation and about their organization and about what can be done to try to improve things right now. Thanks a lot.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, actually, for most of you. Elena and I agree that I would go first trying to provide some background about the current situation in the U.S., which it is not at all an exaggeration to indeed call it a war, on foreign nationals, a war on immigrants, refugees. But, it's important to understand that this is not something that began with the election of Donald Trump in 2016. There is actually a history that I'm going to try to cover in approximately 10 to 15 minutes. Do my best to be as short as I can, or as brief as I can, I should say. But I want to just begin by letting you know that in many ways, what is now unfolding in the U.S. has a lot to do with at least two central changes that have occurred in the U.S. going back to 1970. Number one is the change in the nature of who foreign nationals happen to be. In 1970, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, which is the most important demographic numbers institution in the U.S., 61% of the foreign-born population in the country were actually people of European ancestry. And believe it or not, Mexicans were only 8%, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So from that year, going forward, we have experienced what indeed can be called a revolution in terms of who's coming to the U.S. To the point that today, when you put together Mexicans, other Latin Americans, and Asian nationalities, we have about 86% of the foreign-born population today made up of that kind of foreigner. So the fact that prior to 1970 was a predominantly white foreign-born population, whereas today is predominantly a non-white, non-English speaking population, has a lot to do with the changes that we have seen. And the second imperative is really economics. The bottom line is the U.S. is pretty much alone in the world in terms of having such a large so-called undocumented, irregular, unauthorized, racist people call them illegal, immigrants in the U.S. But that is not an accident. I mean, it is actually the result of policy changes that have occurred pretty much beginning in the 1980s that have led, to this country having such a large population, which ensures vital sectors of the economy to have a very sizable labor force willing to work for very low wages and with great deal of docility in the way they function in the labor market, in the sense that they are basically willing to accept conditions that most other workers would not accept, precisely because of the vulnerability that they face because of their lack of immigration status. But in addition to that, I mean, I think it's also important to suggest that beginning in the 1980s, let me give you my concrete example. I came into the US in 1980, and even through the mid-1980s, I remember very well that with very specific, rare exceptions, I was treated in the US very much like anybody else. I mean, I could access a driver's license, no problem. I could request, if I needed to, public assistance entirely based on merits, not on whether I had status, immigration status in the US. Of course, I couldn't vote, and I couldn't travel freely in and out of the country, which were, some of the most significant limitations that foreign nationals residing in the U.S. without a status face. But more importantly, I could access a job without much difficulty because there wasn't really any major control systems preventing people from getting employment in the US. From that point forward, the reality changed dramatically. We began a new narrative gradually take shape, a narrative that has systematically painted foreign nationals as bad for the country, as a threat, for the country. And this narrative did begin, within circles in the Republican Party, but I would lie if I would say to you that that narrative only resides in the Republican Party. There has been very important leadership circles in the Democratic Party that have also accepted, that narrative and basically have this narrative in the back of their minds, whenever they talk about immigration and how to best treat foreign nationals in the US. I also believe it is important to make clear that the combination of electoral politics, racism, and xenophobia, specifically targeting Mexicans, Latin American, and other minority foreign national segments of the foreign born population in the country, is not something new either. Ironically, the very first place where this combination of factors was used rather effectively was in California in 1994, when a dying re-election campaign by a very unpopular governor managed to be resuscitated, literally, by combining the re-election campaign in 1994 with racist, xenophobic forces that managed to put together a referendum, which are known in California as propositions. Proposition 187 was specifically the referendum I'm talking about. It was an extremely anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican referendum, and ironically, it actually got enacted, it got passed. I mean, the voters of California, in a majority, voted for them, not an overwhelming majority, but a significant percentage of the voters in that year voted for Proposition 187. It was so bad that it was basically knocked down by the US court system, the judicial system, because of it. Basically, it broke, a lot of the basic principles of constitutionality in the US as of then. But ironically, people at the time celebrated the defeat in the courts of this particular referendum, but did not realize that what we had actually done was provide a national platform for organizations with specific interests driven largely by racial and xenophobic hate to actually launch a much larger campaign in 1996 in which several changes were approved, all with a very strong anti-immigrant content. But more important of all of them was the law that became, or the bill that became a law in September of 1996, something that is actually titled Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. That is the name of the law that was passed on September 30th, 1996. And it is an incredibly backwards piece of law. Most of the realities that are affecting immigrant communities today actually trace back, to that particular change in the law in 1996, including the fact that a lot of the provisions in that law were drafted to be applicable retroactively. So not only from that moment forward, but also retroactively applicable so that it could exercise or exert, I should say, the most significant damage against immigrant communities. And let me just end by saying that while people have become more aware of the attack against immigrants under the Trump administration, it is important for you to understand that not a single new law has been enacted, by this administration when it comes to how to treat foreign nationals and how to address the larger question of U.S. immigration policy. They are simply being extremely aggressive, in how to implement, how to enforce existing law. Because the people that are now in the White House, in the Justice Department, are the very people who actually wrote largely, the law that was enacted, as I mentioned, in September of 1996. As a matter of fact, Democrats are not exempted either, from this crazy drive to apply very aggressively existing policy. Let me remind you that President Obama was called, and rightfully so, the porter-in-chief, because he actually managed to remove, to eject from the country the largest number of foreign nationals, primarily from Mexico and Central American countries, during his 8 years in office. And if we then move to what has happened with the Trump administration, which is a part that Elena will be talking about, let me just say that this administration made it very clear, even from the days of the electoral campaign, which began in 2015, with an extremely aggressive anti-Mexican rhetoric on the part of President Trump today, candidate Trump at the time. And the two goals that this administration made very clear they would embrace are the following. Number one, make as difficult as possible for more people coming from undesirable countries. The president actually used an even worse expression to refer to the countries I'm talking about, Latin American, Asian, African countries, to be able to come to the US. And they are committed to do that in multiple ways. Elena, I'm sure will mention some of those. But the second goal, which is no less important, is to remove, to literally eject from the US people who have been in this country for many years. And this does not limit to people residing in the US without authorization. This also includes people that we have, for all practical purposes, provided the possibility to be living legally in the US, such as the case of people who have received protection via something called temporary protected status, or a program also enacted in 2012 by Obama known as deferred action, I believe it is, for childhood arrivals, DACA. But it also includes, believe it or not, even foreign nationals who have actually acquired US citizenship via naturalization. They are all in the crosshair of this administration in terms of people they would like to see ejected from the US. So again, I go back to what I said at the beginning. It is not at all an exaggeration to say that there is a war against immigrants. And the very last thing I want to mention is that a lot of these moves, mainly focusing on foreign nationals in the US, have a lot to do with larger trends, that we have seen in terms of the political landscape in the US, which altogether is heading us today into a society that is becoming very concerningly more and more restrictive, more and more irresponsible in terms of issues of common well-being for populations in the US. And that again, the attack against immigrants is simply one of the most popular ways of advancing views that are altogether extremely conservative, extremely draconian in nature. But I'd like to end with those comments and pass it on to Elena. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's I would say that it's very comforting, particularly in these difficult times, to see concern and interest for what's happening in the US abroad. Sometimes we do feel very lonely, and we know that in each part of the world, immigrants are facing different challenges. It's a very particular anti-immigrant sentiment worldwide, so thank you for being interested in what's happening in the US. Based on the facts and the policy considerations that Oscar put in this discussion, I would like to build on them to discuss specific issues of the current situation and the impact that they have on some specific groups of the population. I think that it's important to bear in mind, as Oscar said, that there has not been any legislation modification during the Trump administration. So this is the same legislation that has been put in place for a long time. What we are observing are perhaps differences in the enforcement, in the priorities, and in the attitude that particularly the Department of Justice is transmitting and requiring of immigration authorities, including immigration judges. That is definitely impacting, and that is being reflected on the ground and on the situation. On the other hand, we also have to be mindful that the conditions that are making many families, many individuals, and even many unaccompanied minors consider the possibility of traveling to the US to seek protection are increasing and are different. Sometimes we are only observing part of the puzzle when we are thinking of what's happening in the US, but we have to still remember that the highest murder rate in the world is disputed between Honduras and El Salvador. And that's the current situation. The inability of those states to control organized crime, particularly gangs, is also an impressive concern that we should keep in mind. Authoritative governments that have or lack any respect for basic human rights of their population is as well an important concern. I would just like to remind you of the elections in Honduras a few months ago, which were elections that should have not been possible because there was a constitutional provision against re-election. Nevertheless, the president ran again. And then there was public demonstrations against those elections that were responded with violence, resulting in a significant number of deaths and arrests. And now this year, if you remember in April, we have observed the protests that are taking place in Nicaragua, and as well the repressive response of Ortega's government towards that population. So we have gangs, we have repressive governments, we have organized crime in Mexico as well. And all of those factors put together continue to expel individuals. So we have individuals who are trying, who need protection, who are fleeing their homes because they do not have any other chances. And on the other hand, we have these efforts to try to make immigration policies more strict. So separation of families when they enter the US is common. It was taking place before. It's not something that is particularly new, and that's something that we have to keep in mind. However, there were specific differences in how that policy was taking place that changed under the current administration. Perhaps the most important change is the decision in terms of how irregular entry was going to be treated. The zero tolerance policy means that rather than treating that irregular entry as an administrative violation and placing that person in deportation proceedings, what they are doing now with those cases is deciding to prosecute them. The expectation that they have is that a criminal prosecution will be an additional deterrent, and that once those individuals are deported, they will think it more than once, perhaps a couple of times before returning to the US. Currently, what is taking place is that those individuals are being prosecuted and they are being sentenced to very short periods of time. In most cases, perhaps the 2-3 weeks that they waited in a jail in pretrial detention to be convicted for the crime of illegal entry, and then they are placed in deportation proceedings. But that remains in their background, and so if they enter the country again, they will face a much higher criminal punishment. We are talking about at least 2-4 years of imprisonment simply for irregularly entering the country. And the fact that they decided to prosecute the parents or the adults for illegal entry meant then that the separation of children from their parents became more frequent than what we were seeing in the past, simply because in county jails, in criminal procedures, you could not have parents with their children. And this clearly became a public outcry. It's interesting to note that it started to happen, and like for a couple of months, the numbers were relatively low, and this was not something that was in the news. And in the current administration, with the daily bombardment of so many issues occurring, it's very difficult for ordinary citizens to know whether they should be watching what's happening with immigration policies, they should be watching what's happening in Washington. The confirmation of the Supreme Court, it's like you always feel like you have to be with eyes everywhere trying to understand what's happening. So what we currently have is a significant number of children. It's estimated that around 300 children who have not been reunited with their parents. And the reason why many of those children were not reunited with their parents is simply because there was not a family file. So simply they were separated, and each of them was given a different case immigration number. Some of those parents were deported, and they did not have a chance to say anything about what was going to happen to their children. Other parents, fearing that the situation that they are living at home is particularly difficult, decided that they would prefer that their children remain in the US and continue seeking asylum as unaccompanied minors, a particularly difficult and painful decision that some of those parents made. There are also some other cases, probably a smaller number, but it's interesting to note of some cases in which immigration authorities have claimed that apparently the parents would have some criminal backgrounds, or they are suspect to be members of gangs, and so it would be against the best interest of those children to be reunited with those parents. And those children then remain separated from their parents. This is an ongoing litigation, but it's something that is happening that I think it's very important. Another change in terms of policy and practices was the change in enforcement priorities. The Obama administration had decided to devote its efforts to the deportation mainly of those individuals who had committed a crime, were sentenced, and after serving their sentences, then they were immediately put in deportation proceedings. The decision of the Trump administration was to abandon any enforcement priorities, so everyone who is in irregular immigration status, regardless of whether they committed any crime or not, regardless of their family situation, regarding of their responsibilities, is immediately, when they have contact with immigration authorities, placed into deportation proceedings. And this has clearly changed the landscape. And it means that for many families that were aware of their undocumented status, but were kind of trying to living an honest life in the US, trying to make ends meet for their families, they are now fearing that at any point, in any corner, any mistake when they are driving, any situation may put them in immigration proceedings, and they may find that the family is faced with the terrible situation of deciding whether they will be separated and part of the family will remain in the US, or whether they should all move to a country that is not the country of many members of their family, and where clearly the states are not prepared to receive these families and to respond to the educational needs, the health needs, the integration needs of those returning migrants and their families, who as a result of this policy would thus become migrant US citizens living abroad. Another important factor is creating a general atmosphere of fear and mistreatment. In the past, for many immigration procedures, it was sufficient to submit the documentation demonstrating that they had fulfilled the requirements, for instance, to request a permanent residence. Now they have decided to conduct personal interviews in all of the cases. Immigration procedures that used to last 6 months are now lasting 12 months, 18 months. Every single visa petition, every single immigration request is treated with great suspicion, and then that does create on the immigrants this fear of, if I make any mistake, I may have no chance or no way out. This morning in this forum that we were organizing, they were saying, like, for instance, in the past, they waived the requirement to interview elderly persons, someone in their 80s. And nowadays, they are demanding that every single family member be interviewed. And that, of course, presents additional challenges and stress on the family. In light with these policies, what we are observing is a total disregard for the concept on the right of family unity. In the Americas, we don't have, as you do in Europe with the Convention, with the Human Rights European Covenant, the idea of the protection of family life. But we do have the right to family unity, and that is being totally disregarded by immigration authorities. We are not observing that any immigration judge is able to even ponder or consider what is going to be the impact of a deportation of a parent on the life of those children. Not even from an economic perspective, not much less from a psychological perspective. There's absolutely total disregard for the impact on those families. I think that it's also important to understand that in this background, we have, as you may have heard, the Muslim ban. If you remember, it was an announcement from Trump candidate that he would stop the entrance of the country of individuals coming from Muslim countries. After 3 tries, because his 2 prior Muslim bans were stopped by the courts, he was successful with a 3rd Muslim ban. Initially, a judge in Hawaii stopped that ban through an injunction, but ultimately it went all the way through the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that the ban could continue. Interestingly enough, in that 3rd trial, what the Trump administration decided to do was to add to the list of Muslim countries, Venezuela and North Korea, trying to kind of dress up this Muslim ban as an immigration policy, trying particularly to address conditions of safety, terrorism, and the quality of the passport information coming from those countries. What is most concerning is that in June of this year, the Supreme Court decided that that Muslim ban was constitutional, that the president had met the threshold to establish that this policy had some kind of rationale or foundation. And they decided to disregard all of the rhetoric of the president and rather concentrate on the powers of the presidency, the powers that the executive power has on immigration matters. So what we have to keep in mind is that we have the foundation of a legislation established in the 80s that grants great discretion to the executive branch of power. And we have in power an administration that is trying to put in place and tighten all the controls possible against the immigrant population in a system of rights protections that appears to be weakened in ways that we had not seen before. And even though we do see the concern of civil society and some groups that are trying to support organizations like the ACLU, the American Civil Liberty Unions, other organizations that are working on immigration cases, attorneys who are volunteering, doing weekly shifts in detention centers of the border, it sometimes appears that all of these individual and collective efforts are not sufficient to face the current situation, the crisis in which we are at the current moment. So my picture is bleak, but I have to confess that the environment that we are observing, that we are feeling here in the US, is definitely of a moment of crisis where it is important for every US citizen, and I would add, for every concerned human being, regardless of whether you are a US citizen and you have any saying, you can vote or not, to speak about what is happening, particularly in the US, and to be watchful of what may be happening in other countries, including in Europe. We read the news, for instance, about what's happening in Italy, and it seems too close to what we are observing here, and we are equally concerned. So with that, we welcome your comments and suggestions. Ahead of time, I would like to ask you to excuse myself. I'm teaching at 2 o'clock, so I will only be able to stay here for another 10 minutes, and then I have to leave. Thank you.